Hey, welcome to Socialism for All. This file is being recorded for the August 2025 edition of Socialism for All, and it's an audiobook of Karl Marx's Capital, Volume 1, Chapter 19, The Transformation of the Value and Respective Price of Labor Power into Wages from 1867. If you like this video, please click like and subscribe, and consider supporting on Patreon, or buy me a coffee at patreon.com/socialismforall, or buymeacoffee.com/socialismforall. There are links to Patreon and Buy Me a Coffee in the video description. So Chapter 19 is the first of 4 chapters in Part 6 of 8 of Capital, Wages. In this particular chapter, Marx is going to drill down into something we've covered before, but now we're going to do it in more detail, which is how the wage form obscures or conceals the actual nature of the exploitation of labor by making it appear that the laborer is being paid for all of the labor that they're performing, when in fact they're not. We know that part of the working day is necessary labor time, and that's going to go back to the worker as wages. The value they create is going to go back to the worker, and that the rest of the day is surplus labor producing surplus value, which is basically free stuff that the capitalist gets, which they are not paying the laborer for, and which is the source of profit in capitalism. And without that surplus labor and surplus value, you would not have capitalist production. The capitalists say, come work for us, we'll give you the wages that you need to sustain your life, but the price of admission to the workplace that we own and control on a private bourgeois property basis is that in addition to generating the value that's going to cover your wages, you work as long as we can get you to work, making us free stuff, whether that's tangible goods or less tangible service-type production. And in particular in this chapter, Marx is, like in some of the most recent chapters, going to go through some of the classic thinkers of political economy who basically have been defending capitalism and criticize their positions and explain how they're contributing to this mystification and how to cut through that. So let's begin. Chapter 19. The Transformation of the Value and Respective Price of Labor Power into Wages. On the surface of bourgeois society, the wage of the laborer appears as the price of labor, a certain quantity of money that is paid for a certain quantity of labor. Thus people speak of the value of labor and call its expression in money its necessary or natural price. On the other hand, they speak of the market prices of labor, i.e. prices oscillating above or below its natural price. But what is the value of a commodity? It's the objective form of the social labor expended in its production. And how do we measure the quantity of this value? By the quantity of the labor contained in it. How then is the value, for example, of a 12-hour working day to be determined? By the 12 working hours contained in a working day of 12 hours, which is an absurd tautology. Footnote here quoting a critical dissertation on the nature, etc. of value. Mr. Ricardo ingeniously enough avoids a difficulty which, on a first view, threatens to encumber his doctrine, that value depends on the quantity of labor employed in production. If this principle is rigidly adhered to, it follows that the value of labor depends on the quantity of labor employed in producing it, which is evidently absurd. By a dexterous turn, therefore, Mr. Ricardo makes the value of labor depend on the quantity of labor required to produce wages, or, to give him the benefit of his own language, he maintains that the value of labor is to be estimated by the quantity of labor required to produce wages, by which he means the quantity of labor required to produce the money or commodities given to the laborer. This is similar to saying that the value of cloth is estimated not by the quantity of labor bestowed on its production, but by the quantity of labor bestowed on the production of the silver for which the cloth is exchanged. Back to the main text. In order to be sold as a commodity in the market, labor must at all events exist before it's sold. But could the laborer give it an independent objective existence, comment i.e. by making something, continuing, they would sell a commodity and not labor. Footnote quoting from Observations on Certain Verbal Disputes, etc. If you call labor a commodity, it is not like a commodity which is first produced in order to exchange and then brought to market, where it must exchange with other commodities according to the respective quantities of each, which there may be in the market at the time. Labor is created the moment it is brought to market. Nay, it is brought to market before it is created. Back to the main text. Apart from these contradictions, a direct exchange of money, i.e. of realized labor, with living labor would either do away with the law of value, which only begins to develop itself freely on the basis of capitalist production, or do away with capitalist production itself, which rests directly on wage labor. The working day of 12 hours embodies itself, for example, in a money value of 6 shillings. Either equivalents are exchanged, and then the laborer receives 6 shillings for 12 hours labor. The price of their labor would be equal to the price of their product. In this case, they produce no surplus value for the buyer of their labor. The 6 shillings are not transformed into capital. The basis of capitalist production vanishes. But it is on this very basis that they sell their labor, and that their labor is wage labor. Or else they receive for 12 hours labor less than 6 shillings, i.e. less than 12 hours labor. 12 hours labor are exchanged against 10, 6, etc. hours labor. This equalization of unequal quantities not merely does away with the determination of value. Such a self-destructive contradiction cannot in any way even be enunciated or formulated as a law. Footnote quoting from E.G. Wakefield in his edition of Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations, 1836, treating labor as a commodity, and capital, the produce of labor, as another. Then, if the values of these two commodities were regulated by equal quantities of labor, a given amount of labor would exchange for that quantity of capital which had been produced by the same amount of labor. Antecedent labor would exchange for the same amount as present labor, but the value of labor in relation to other commodities is determined not by equal quantities of labor. Back to the main text. It is of no avail to deduce the exchange of more labor against less from their difference of form, the one being realized, the other living. And commenting just to clarify that, when Marx is talking about realized labor, or labor given objective form, he's talking about a product that was produced by labor, and living labor being the labor of a living person being enacted. And there's a footnote there quoting Sismondi, 1803, on commercial wealth. Quote, there has to be a new agreement, Marx adds, a new edition of the social contract, exclamation point. Quote, that whenever there is an exchange of work done for work to be done, the latter, Marx adds meaning the capitalist, is to receive a higher value than the former, Marx adds meaning the worker. Back to the main text. This is the more absurd as the value of a commodity is determined not by the quantity of labor actually realized in it, but by the quantity of living labor necessary for its production. A commodity represents, say, 6 working hours. If an invention is made by which it can be produced in 3 hours, the value, even of the commodity already produced, falls by half. It represents now 3 hours of social labor instead of the 6 formerly necessary. It is the quantity of labor required for its production, not the realized form of that labor, by which the amount of the value of a commodity is determined. That which comes directly face to face with the possessor of money on the market is in fact not labor but the laborer. What the latter sells is their labor power. As soon as their labor actually begins, it has already ceased to belong to them. It can therefore no longer be sold by them. Labor is the substance and the immanent measure of value, but has itself no value. Footnote quoting Thomas Hodgkin's Popular Political Economy, labor, the exclusive standard of value, the creator of all wealth, is no commodity. Back to the main text. In the expression, value of labor, the idea of value is not only completely obliterated but actually reversed. It is an expression as imaginary as the value of the earth. These imaginary expressions arise, however, from the relations of production themselves. They are categories for the phenomenal forms of essential relations. That in their appearance things often represent themselves in inverted form is pretty well known in every science, except political economy. Footnote, on the other hand, the attempt to explain such expressions as merely poetic license only shows the impotence of the analysis. Hence, in answer to Proudhon's phrase, quote, labor is called value not as being a commodity itself, but in view of the values supposed to be potentially embodied in it. The value of labor is a figurative expression, unquote, etc. I have remarked, quote, in labor, commodity, which is a frightful reality, Proudhon sees nothing but a grammatical ellipsis. The whole of existing society, then, based upon labor commodity, is henceforth based upon a poetic license, on a figurative expression. Does society desire to eliminate all the inconveniences which trouble it, it has only to eliminate all the ill-sounding terms. Let it change the language, and for that it only has to address itself to the Academy and ask it for a new edition of its dictionary, unquote, that's from The Poverty of Philosophy. It is naturally still more convenient to understand by value nothing at all. Then one can without difficulty subsume everything under this category. Thus, for example, J.B. say, quote, what is value? Answer, quote, that which a thing is worth. And what is, quote, price? Answer, quote, the value of a thing expressed in money, unquote. And why has agriculture a value? Answer, quote, because one sets a price on it, unquote. Therefore, value is what a thing is worth, and the land has its, quote, value because its value is, quote, expressed in money. This is anyhow a very simple way of explaining the why and the wherefore of things. Back to the main text. Classical political economy borrowed from everyday life the category price of labor without further criticism, and then simply asked the question, how is this price determined? It soon recognized that the change in the relations of demand and supply, explained in regard to the price of labor, as of all other commodities, nothing except its changes, i.e. the oscillations of the market price above or below a certain mean. If demand and supply balance, the oscillation of prices ceases, all other conditions remaining the same. But then demand and supply also cease to explain anything. The price of labor at the moment when demand and supply are in equilibrium is its natural price, determined independently of the relation of demand and supply. And how this price is determined is just the question. Or a larger period of oscillations in the market price is taken, for example a year, and they're found to cancel one the other, leaving a mean average quantity, a relatively constant magnitude. This had naturally to be determined otherwise than by its own compensating variations. This price, which always finally predominates over the accidental market prices of labor and regulates them, this, quote, necessary price, quoting the physiocrats, or natural price, quoting Adam Smith, of labor, can, as with all other commodities, be nothing else than its value expressed in money. In this way, political economy expected to penetrate athwart the accidental prices of labor to the value of labor. As with other commodities, this value was determined by the cost of production. But what is the cost of production? Of the laborer, i.e. the cost of producing or reproducing the laborer themselves. This question unconsciously substituted itself in political economy for the original one. For the search after the cost of production in labor as such turned in a circle and never left the spot. What economists therefore call value of labor is in fact the value of labor power, as it exists in the personality of the laborer, which is as different from its function, labor, as a machine is from the work it performs. Occupied with the difference between the market price of labor and its so-called value, with the relation of this value to the rate of profit, and to the values of the commodities produced by means of labor, etc., they never discovered that the course of the analysis had led not only from the market prices of labor to its presumed value, but had led to the resolution of this value of labor itself into the value of labor power. Classical economy never arrived at a consciousness of the results of its own analysis. It accepted uncritically the categories value of labor, natural price of labor, etc., as final and as adequate expressions for the value relation under consideration, and was thus led, as will be seen later, into inextricable confusion and contradiction, while it offered to the vulgar economists a secure basis of operations for their shallowness, which on principle worships appearances only. Let us next see how value and price of labor power present themselves in this transformed condition as wages. We know that the daily value of labor power is calculated upon a certain length of the laborer's life, to which again corresponds a certain length of working day. Assume the habitual working day as 12 hours, the daily value of labor power as 3 shillings, the expression in money of a value that embodies 6 hours of labor. If the laborer receives 3 shillings, then they receive the value of their labor power functioning through 12 hours. If now this value of a day's labor power is expressed as the value of a day's labor itself, we have the formula 12 hours labor has a value of 3 shillings. The value of labor power thus determines the value of labor, or, expressed in money, its necessary price. If on the other hand the price of labor power differs from its value, in like manner, the price of labor differs from its so-called value. As the value of labor is only an irrational expression for the value of labor power, it follows of course that the value of labor must always be less than the value it produces, for the capitalist always makes labor power work longer than is necessary for the reproduction of its own value. In the above example, the value of the labor power that functions through 12 hours is 3 shillings, a value for the reproduction of which 6 hours are required. The value which the labor power produces is, on the other hand, 6 shillings, because it, in fact, functions during 12 hours, and the value it produces depends not on its own value, but on the length of time it is in action. Thus, we have a result absurd at first sight that labor which creates a value of 6 shillings possesses a value of 3 shillings. Footnote, see also Criticism of Political Economy, where I state that in the portion of that work that deals with capital, this problem will be solved. How does production, on the basis of exchange value determined simply by labor time, lead to the result that the exchange value of labor is less than the exchange value of its product? Back to the main text. We see further the value of 3 shillings, by which a part only of the working day, i.e. 6 hours labor, is paid for, appears as the value or the price of the whole working day of 12 hours, which thus includes 6 hours unpaid for. The wage form thus extinguishes every trace of the division of the working day into necessary labor and surplus labor, into paid and unpaid labor. All labor appears as paid labor. In the corvée, the labor of the worker for themselves and their compulsory labor for the lord differ in space and time in the clearest possible way. In slave labor, even that part of the working day in which the slave is only replacing the value of their own means of existence, in which therefore, in fact they work for themselves alone, appears as labor for their master. All the slave's labor appears as unpaid labor. Footnote, the Morning Star, a London free trade organ, naive to silliness, protested again and again during the American Civil War, with all the moral indignation of which man is capable, that the Negro in the Confederate States worked absolutely for nothing. It should have compared the daily cost of such a Negro with that of the free worker in the East End of London. Back to the main text. In wage labor, on the contrary, even surplus labor or unpaid labor appears as paid. There, the property relation conceals the labor of the slave for themselves. Here, the money relation conceals the unrequited labor of the wage laborer. Hence, we may understand the decisive importance of the transformation of value and price of labor power into the form of wages, or into the value and price of labor itself. This phenomenal form, which makes the actual relation invisible, and indeed shows the direct opposite of that relation, forms the basis of all the juridical notions of both laborer and capitalist, of all the mystifications of the capitalistic mode of production, of all its illusions as to liberty, of all the apologetic shifts of the vulgar economists. If history took a long time to get at the bottom of the mystery of wages, nothing, on the other hand, is easier to understand than the necessity, the raison d'etre of this phenomenon. The exchange between capital and labor at first presents itself to the mind in the same guise as the buying and selling of all other commodities. The buyer gives a certain sum of money, the seller an article of a nature different from money. The jurist's consciousness recognizes in this at most a material difference, expressed in the juridically equivalent formula, I give in order that you may give. I give in order that you may produce. I produce so that you may give. I produce so that you may produce. Furthermore, exchange value and use value, being intrinsically incommensurable magnitudes, the expressions value of labor, price of labor do not seem more irrational than the expressions value of cotton, price of cotton. Moreover, the laborer is paid after they have given their labor. In its function of means of payment, money realizes subsequently the value or price of the article supplied, i.e., in this particular case, the value or price of the labor supplied. Finally, the use value supplied by the laborer to the capitalist is not in fact their labor power, but its function, some definite useful labor, the work of tailoring, shoemaking, spinning, etc. That the same labor is, on the other hand, the universal value-creating element, and thus possesses a property by which it differs from all other commodities, is beyond the cognizance of the ordinary mind. Let us put ourselves in the place of the laborer who receives for 12 hours labor, say the value produced by 6 hours labor, say 3 shillings. For them, in fact, their 12 hours labor is the means of buying the 3 shillings. The value of their labor power may vary with the value of their usual means of subsistence from 3 to 4 shillings or from 3 to 2 shillings, or if the value of their labor power remains constant, its price may, in consequence of changing relations of demand and supply, rise to 4 shillings or fall to 2. They always give 12 hours of labor. Every change in the amount of the equivalent that they receive appears to them, therefore, necessarily as a change in the value or price of their 12 hours' work. This circumstance misled Adam Smith, who treated the working day as a constant quantity, and only accidentally alluded to the variation of the working day when he was referring to piece wages, to the assertion that the value of labor is constant, although the value of the means of subsistence may vary, and the same working day, therefore, may represent itself in more or less money for the laborer. Let us consider, on the other hand, the capitalist. They wish to receive as much labor as possible for as little money as possible. Practically, therefore, the only thing that interests them is the difference between the price of labor power and the value which its function creates. But then they try to buy all commodities as cheaply as possible, and always account for their profit by simple cheating, by buying under and selling over the value. Hence, they never come to see that if such a thing as the value of labor really existed, and they really paid this value, no capital would exist. Their money would not be turned into capital. Moreover, the actual movement of wages presents phenomena which seem to prove that not the value of labor power is paid, but the value of its function, of labor itself. We may reduce these phenomena to 2 great classes. 1. Change of wages with the changing length of the working day. One might as well conclude that not the value of a machine is paid, but that of its working, because it costs more to hire a machine for a week than for a day. 2. The individual difference in the wages of different laborers who do the same kind of work. We find this individual difference, but are not deceived by it in the system of slavery, where, frankly and openly, without any circumlocution, labor power itself is sold. Only in the slave system, the advantage of a labor power above the average, and the disadvantage of a labor power below the average, affects the slave owner. In the wage labor system, it affects the laborer themselves, because their labor power is, in the one case, sold by themselves, in the other by a third person. For the rest, in respect to the phenomenal form, value and price of labor, or wages, as contrasted with the essential relation manifested therein, viz., the value and price of labor power, the same difference holds that holds in respect to all phenomena and their hidden substratum. The former appear directly and spontaneously as current modes of thought. The latter must first be discovered by science. Comment, this is why we don't just try to vibe things. Continuing, classical political economy nearly touches the true relation of things without, however, consciously formulating it. This it cannot, so long as it sticks in its bourgeois skin. And that's the end of chapter 19, or in other words, as Marx was concluding there at the end, if we stick with a capitalist perspective, we're never going to get to the objective reality of what's going on in capitalism. So hopefully this was helpful, and like I said, the next 3 chapters are also going to remain on the topic of wages, delving into subtopics such as time wages, piece wages, and national differences of wages. So look for those coming soon. And in the meantime, if you have a question or comment, leave those below, and we will continue the discussion in the comments section as always. Otherwise, thanks for listening, and thanks to the current patrons and Buy Me a Coffee supporters, whose names are on the screen. If you'd like to get your name on the screen, head to patreon.com/socialismforall or buymeacoffee.com/socialismforall. Every donation's encouraging, they're also materially helpful, and they allow me to spend a lot more time on this channel than I'd be able to do otherwise, particularly as we don't run ads on this content. So if you like this channel and have learned something from it, thank me, but also thank a patron or Buy Me a Coffee supporter, and consider becoming one yourself. Beyond that, engagement counts, so like, share, subscribe. And remember, we can do a lot of agitation and education online, but the organizing happens in real life. So make sure to take what you've learned here into your real-world political organizing. Thanks again, and we'll see you in the next video. Hey, welcome to Socialism for All. This file's being recorded for the August 2025 edition of Socialism for All, and it's an audiobook of Marx's Capital, Volume 1, Chapter 20, Time Wages, from 1867. If you like this video, please click like and subscribe, and consider supporting on Patreon or Buy Me a Coffee at patreon.com/socialismforall or buymeacoffee.com/socialismforall. There are links to Patreon and Buy Me a Coffee in the video description. So chapter 20 is the second chapter of 4 in part 6 of 8 of Capital Volume 1, Wages. The last chapter, chapter 19, was an introduction to this section in which Marx examined some of the classical political economy which was defending capitalism and criticized those thinkers for failing to discover in their investigations how the capitalist mode of production uses the wage form of labor to obscure exploitation. In other words, it tries to make it look as though the laborer is paid for all of the labor that they perform, when in reality, part of the working day is necessary labor, which does go back to the worker in the form of wages, but then necessarily also in capitalism, there is an additional portion of the working day, surplus labor, which creates surplus value, which is the basis of profit, and that just goes to the capitalist for free. So in this chapter on time wages, which discusses wages which are paid to the worker corresponding to increments of time, whether it's by the hour or the day or the week, whatever. And then the next chapter, 21, is going to discuss another major form of wages, piece wages, by which workers are paid by the number of widgets or whatever else that they produce. We talked about piece wages back in chapter 15 when we were talking about the children who were crammed into the rooms with very little space working on the lace and the straw plaiting. In any case, no matter the form that the wages take, Marx's point is that wages in general disguise the exploitation of labor. And we discussed this back in some of the very early chapters of this book, in which we contrasted what is recognized under the capitalist system as wage theft, in which, for example, it's recognized that you worked 8 hours, but you only get paid for 7. And, that's something that you can report these days to your local Department of Labor and try to get remedy. But Marx's point is that there's a bigger point, not just wage theft, but the exploitation of labor in general. That what you're being paid for those 8 hours, even if it's legal and above board, is actually a small fraction of the value that you produced during your shift. The rest, again, going to the capitalist for free. That being one of the main topics, Marx is also going to delve into finer supporting points about differences in the rate of exploitation, which may be concealed by time wages, and also how this can give rise to competition between workers. Let's begin. Wages themselves again take many forms, a fact not recognizable in the ordinary economic treatises which, exclusively interested in the material side of the question, neglect every difference of form. An exposition of all these forms, however, belongs to the special study of wage labor, not therefore to this work. Still, the two fundamental forms must be briefly worked out here. The sale of labor power, as will be remembered, takes place for a definite period of time. The converted form under which the daily, weekly, etc. value of labor power presents itself is hence that of time wages, therefore day wages, etc. Next, it is to be noted that the laws set forth in the 17th chapter on the changes in the relative magnitudes of price of labor power and surplus value pass by a simple transformation of form into laws of wages. Similarly, the distinction between the exchange value of labor power and the sum of the necessaries of life into which this value is converted now reappears as the distinction between nominal and real wages. It would be useless to repeat here with regard to the phenomenal form what has already been worked out in the substantial form. We limit ourselves, therefore, to a few points characteristic of time wages. The sum of money, and for the purpose of this discussion the value of the money itself is always supposed to be constant, which the laborer receives for their daily or weekly labor forms the amount of their nominal wages, or of their wages estimated in value. But it is clear that according to the length of the working day, that is, according to the amount of actual labor daily supplied, the same daily or weekly wage may represent very different prices of labor, i.e. very different sums of money for the same quantity of labor. Footnote quoting Sir Edward West's Price of Corn and Wages of Labor, 1836, the price of labor is the sum paid for a given quantity of labor, unquote. West is the author of the anonymous Essay on the Application of Capital to Land by a Fellow of the University College of Oxford, London, 1815, an epoch-making work in the history of political economy. Back to the main text. We must therefore, in considering time wages, again distinguish between the sum total of the daily or weekly wages, etc., and the price of labor. How then to find this price, i.e. the money value of a given quantity of labor? The average price of labor is found when the average daily value of the labor power is divided by the average number of hours in the working day. If, for example, the daily value of labor power is 3 shillings, the value of the product of 6 working hours, and if the working day is 12 hours, the price of 1 working hour is 3/12 shillings, or 3 pence. The price of the working hour thus found serves as the unit measure for the price of labor. It follows, therefore, that the daily and weekly wages, etc., may remain the same, although the price of labor falls constantly. If, for example, the habitual working day is 10 hours and the daily value of the labor power 3 shillings, the price of the working hour is 3 3/5 pence. It falls to 3 pence as soon as the working day rises to 12 hours, to 2 2/5 pence as soon as it rises to 15 hours. Daily or weekly wages remain, despite all this, unchanged. On the contrary, the daily or weekly wages may rise, although the price of labor remains constant, or even falls. If, for example, the working day is 10 hours and the daily value of labor power is 3 shillings, the price of 1 working hour is 3 3/5 pence. If the laborer, in consequence of increase of trade, works 12 hours, the price of labor remaining the same, their daily wage now rises to 3 shillings 7 1/5 pence without any variation in the price of labor. The same result might follow if, instead of the extensive amount of labor, its intensive amount increased. Comment, the extensive amount meaning the extent of the working day, the total number of hours. The intensity being the amount of labor performed within that amount of time. Continuing, we have a footnote, quoting West, same source, the wages of labor depend upon the price of labor and the quantity of labor performed. An increase in the wages of labor does not necessarily imply an enhancement of the price of labor. From fuller employment and greater exertions, there's the intensity, the wages of labor may be considerably increased, while the price of labor may continue the same, unquote. The main question, how is the price of labor determined, West, however, dismisses with mere banalities. Back to the main text. The rise of the nominal daily or weekly wages may therefore be accompanied by a price of labor that remains stationary or falls. The same holds as to the income of the laborer's family as soon as the quantity of labor expended by the head of the family is increased by the labor of the members of their family. There are therefore methods of lowering the price of labor independent of the reduction of the nominal daily or weekly wages. Footnote: this is perceived by the fanatical representative of the industrial bourgeoisie of the 18th century, the author of the Essay on Trade and Commerce often quoted by us, although he puts the matter in a confused way. Quote, "It is the quantity of labor and not the price of it." Marx adds he means by this the nominal daily or weekly wages, quote, "that is determined by the price of provisions and other necessaries. Reduce the price of necessaries very low, and of course you reduce the quantity of labor in proportion. Master manufacturers know that there are various ways of raising and felling the price of labor besides that of altering its nominal amount." Unquote. In his 3 lectures on the rate of wages, London, 1830, in which N.W. Sr. uses West's work without mentioning it, he says, quote, "The laborer is principally interested in the amount of wages," unquote. That is to say, the laborer is principally interested in what they receive, the nominal sum of their wages, not in that which they give, the amount of labor. Back to the main text. As a general law, it follows that, given the amount of daily or weekly labor, etc., the daily or weekly wages depend on the price of labor, which itself varies either with the value of labor power or with the difference between its price and its value. Given, on the other hand, the price of labor, the daily or weekly wages depend on the quantity of the daily or weekly labor. The unit measure for time wages, the price of the working hour, is the quotient of the value of a day's labor power divided by the number of hours of the average working day. Let the latter be 12 hours, and the daily value of labor power, 3 shillings, the value of the product of 6 hours of labor. Under these circumstances, the price of a working hour is 3 pence. The value produced in it is 6 pence. If the laborer is now employed less than 12 hours, or less than 6 days in the week, for example, only 6 or 8 hours, they receive, with this price of labor, only 2 shillings or 1 shilling 6 pence a day. Footnote: the effect of such an abnormal lessening of employment is quite different from that of a general reduction of the working day enforced by law. The former has nothing to do with the absolute length of the working day, and may occur just as well in a working day of 15 as of 6 hours. The normal price of labor is in the first case calculated on the laborer working 15 hours, in the second case on their working 6 hours a day on the average. The result is therefore the same if they, in the one case, are employed only for 7.5, in the other only for 3 hours. Back to the main text. As on our hypothesis, they must work on the average 6 hours daily in order to produce a day's wage corresponding merely to the value of their labor power. As according to the same hypothesis, they work only half of every hour for themselves and half for the capitalist. It is clear that they cannot obtain for themselves the value of the product of 6 hours if they are employed less than 12 hours. In previous chapters, we saw the destructive consequences of overwork. Here we find the sources of the sufferings that result to the laborer from their insufficient employment. If the hour's wage is fixed so that the capitalist does not bind themselves to pay a day's or a week's wage, but only to pay wages for the hours during which they choose to employ the laborer, they can employ them for a shorter time than that which is originally the basis of the calculation of the hour wage, or the unit measure of the price of labor. Since this unit is determined by the ratio daily value of labor power divided by the working day of a given number of hours, it does of course lose all meaning as soon as the working day ceases to contain a definite number of hours. The connection between the paid and the unpaid labor is destroyed. The capitalist can now wring from the laborer a certain quantity of surplus labor without allowing them the labor time necessary for their own subsistence. The capitalist can annihilate all regularity of employment and, according to their own convenience, caprice, and the interest of the moment, make the most enormous overwork alternate with relative or absolute cessation of work. The capitalist can, under the pretense of paying the quote, normal price of labor, abnormally lengthen the working day without any corresponding compensation to the laborer. Hence the perfectly rational revolt in 1860 of the London laborers, employed in the building trades, against the attempt of the capitalists to impose on them this sort of wage by the hour. The legal limitation of the working day puts an end to such mischief, although not, of course, to the diminution of employment caused by the competition of machinery, by changes in the quality of the laborers employed, and by crises, partial or general. Comment, and remember, by crises, he means what we would basically call recessions today. Continuing. With an increasing daily or weekly wage, the price of labor may remain nominally constant and yet fall below its normal level. This occurs every time that the price of labor, reckoned by working hour, remaining constant, the working day is prolonged beyond its customary length. If in the fraction daily value of labor power divided by working day, the denominator increases, meaning length of the working day, the numerator, the daily value of labor power, increases yet more rapidly. The value of labor power, as dependent on its wear and tear, increases with the duration of its functioning, and in more rapid proportion than the increase of that duration. In many branches of industry where time wage is the general rule, without legal limits to the working time, the habit has therefore spontaneously grown up of regarding the working day as normal only up to a certain point, e.g. up to the expiration of the 10th hour. Quote, normal working day, quote, the day's work, quote, the regular hours of work. Beyond this limit, the working time is overtime, and is, taking the hour as unit measure, paid better, extra pay, although often in a proportion ridiculously small. Footnote, quote, the rate of payment for overtime in lace making is so small, and this is quoting the Child's Employment Commission Report No. 2, from 1/2 pence and 3/4 pence to 2 pence per hour, that it stands in painful contrast to the amount of injury produced to the health and stamina of the workpeople. The small amount thus earned is also often obliged to be spent in extra nourishment, unquote. Back to the main text. The normal working day exists here as a fraction of the actual working day, and the latter, often during the whole year, lasts longer than the former. Footnote, for example, in paper staining before the recent introduction into this trade of the Factory Act. Quoting Mr. Smith's evidence in Child Employment Commission first report, we work on with no stoppage for meals so that the day's work of 10.5 hours is finished by 4:30 p.m., and all after that is overtime, and we seldom leave off working before 6 p.m., so that we are really working overtime the whole year round. Unquote. Back to the main text. The increase in the price of labor with the extension of the working day beyond a certain normal limit takes such a shape in various British industries that the low price of labor during the so-called normal time compels the laborer to work during the better paid overtime if they wish to obtain a sufficient wage at all. Footnote, for example, in the Scotch bleaching works, quote, in some parts of Scotland, this trade, Marx adds before the introduction of the Factory Act in 1862, quote, was carried on by a system of overtime, i.e. 10 hours a day were the regular hours of work for which a nominal wage of 1 shilling 2 pence per day was paid to a man, there being every day overtime for 3 or 4 hours paid at the rate of 3 shillings per hour. The effect of this system was a man could not earn more than 8 shillings per week when working the ordinary hours. Without overtime, they could not earn a fair day's wages. Unquote. That's from the Report of Inspector of Factories, April 30, 1863. Quoting the same report, April 30, 1848, the higher wages for getting adult males to work longer hours are a temptation too strong to be resisted. Unquote. The bookbinding trade in the City of London employs very many young girls from 14 to 15 years old, and that under indentures which prescribe certain definite hours of labor. Nevertheless, they work in the last week of each month until 10, 11, 12, or 1 o'clock at night, along with the older laborers in a very mixed company. Quoting the Children's Employment Commission Fifth Report, the masters tempt them by extra pay and supper, which they eat in neighboring public houses. The great debauchery thus produced among these young immortals is compensated by the fact that among the rest many Bibles and religious books are bound by them. Ha ha. Back to the main text. Legal limitation of the working day puts an end to these amenities. Footnote, see Report of Inspector of Factories, 30 April, 1863. With very accurate appreciation of the state of things, the London laborers employed in the building trades declared, during the Great Strike and Lockout of 1860, that they would only accept wages by the hour under 2 conditions. 1. That with the price of the working hour, a normal working day of 9 and 10 hours, respectively, should be fixed, and that the price of the hour for the 10 hours working day should be higher than that for the hour of the 9 hours working day. And 2, that every hour beyond the normal working day should be reckoned as overtime and proportionally more highly paid. Back to the main text. It is a fact generally known that the longer the working days in any branch of industry, the lower are the wages. Footnote, quoting the Report of Inspector of Factories, 31st October, 1863, it is a very notable thing, too, that where long hours are the rule, small wages are also so. And quoting the Public Health Sixth Report, 1864, the work which obtains the scanty pittance of food is, for the most part, excessively prolonged. Back to the main text. A. Redgrave, factory inspector, illustrates this by a comparative review of the 20 years from 1839 to 59, according to which wages rose in the factories under the 10 hours law, while they fell in the factories in which the work lasted 14 to 15 hours daily. From the law, the price of labor being given, the daily or weekly wage depends on the quantity of labor expended. It follows first of all that the lower the price of labor, the greater must be the quantity of labor, or the longer must be the working day for the laborer to secure even a miserable average wage. The lowness of the price of labor acts here as a stimulus to the extension of the labor time. Footnote, the hand nail makers in England, for example, have, on account of the low price of labor, to work 15 hours a day in order to hammer out, no pun intended, their miserable weekly wage. Quote, it's a great many hours in the day, 6 a.m. to 8 p.m., and he has to work hard all the time to get 11 pence or 1 shilling. And there's the wear of the tools, the cost of firing, and something for waste iron to go out of this, which takes off altogether 2.5 pence or 3 pence. That's quoting the Children's Employment Commission third report. The women earn by the same working time a week's wage of only 5 shillings. Back to the main text. On the other hand, the extension of the working time produces, in its turn, a fall in the price of labor, and with this a fall in the day's or week's wages. The determination of the price of labor by daily value of labor power divided by working day of a given number of hours shows that a mere prolongation of the working day lowers the price of labor, if no compensation steps in. But the same circumstances which allow the capitalist in the long run to prolong the working day also allow them first, and compel them finally, to nominally lower the price of labor until the total price of the increased number of hours is lowered, and therefore the daily or weekly wage. Reference to 2 circumstances is sufficient here. If one man does the work of 1.5 or 2 men, the supply of labor increases, although the supply of labor power on the market remains constant. The competition thus created between the laborers allows the capitalist to beat down the price of labor, while the falling price of labor allows them, on the other hand, to screw up still further the working time. Footnote, if a factory hand, for example, refused to work the customary long hours, quote, he would very shortly be replaced by somebody who would work any length of time and thus be thrown out of employment. That's quoting the report of Inspector of Factories, 30 April 1848. And quoting Senior, if one man performs the work of 2, the rate of profits will generally be raised, in consequence of the additional supply of labor having diminished its price. Unquote, back to the main text. Soon, however, this command over abnormal quantities of unpaid labor, i.e. quantities in excess of the average social amount, becomes a source of competition among the capitalists themselves. A part of the price of the commodity consists of the price of labor. The unpaid part of the labor price need not be reckoned in the price of the commodity. It may be presented to the buyer. This is the first step to which competition leads. The second step to which it drives is to exclude also from the selling price of the commodity at least a part of the abnormal surplus value created by the extension of the working day. In this way, an abnormally low selling price of the commodity arises, at first sporadically, and becomes fixed by degrees. A lower selling price, which henceforward becomes the constant basis of a miserable wage for an excessive working time, as originally it was the product of these very circumstances. This movement is simply indicated here, as the analysis of competition does not belong to this part of our subject. Nevertheless, the capitalist may, for a moment, speak for themselves. Quote, in Birmingham, there is so much competition of masters one against another, that many are obliged to do things as employers that they would otherwise be ashamed of, and yet no more money is made, but only the public gets the benefit. That quote is from the Children's Employment Third Commission report. The reader will remember the 2 sorts of London bakers, of whom one sold the bread at its full price, the full-priced bakers, the other below its normal price, the underpriced or undersellers. The full-priced denounced their rivals before the Parliamentary Committee of Inquiry. Quote, they only exist now by first defrauding the public, and next getting 18 hours work out of their men for 12 hours wages. The unpaid labor of the men was made the source whereby the competition was carried on, and continues so to this day. The competition among the master bakers is the cause of the difficulty in getting rid of night work. An underseller who sells his bread below the cost price according to the price of flour must make it up by getting more out of the labor of the men. If I got only 12 hours work out of my men, and my neighbor got 18 or 20, he must beat me in the selling price. If the men could insist on payment for overwork, this would be set right. A large number of those employed by the undersellers are foreigners and youths. The more things change, the more they stay the same, who are obliged to accept almost any wages they can obtain. That's quoting from the report, etc., relative to the grievances complained of by the journeyman bakers, London, 1862. And Marx adds, anyhow, the full-priced bakers, as was mentioned above, and as their spokesman Bennett himself admits, makes their men, quote, generally begin work at 11 p.m. up to 8 o'clock the next morning. They are then engaged all day long as late as 7 o'clock in the evening, unquote. Back to the main text. This Jeremiad is also interesting because it shows how the appearance only of the relations of production mirrors itself in the brain of the capitalist. The capitalist does not know that the normal price of labor also includes a definite quantity of unpaid labor, and that this very unpaid labor is the normal source of their gain. Comment, so, among other things, they go on thinking that all this is fair and right. Continuing, the category of surplus labor time does not exist at all for them, since it is included in the normal working day, which the capitalist thinks they've paid for in the day's wages. But overtime does exist for them, the prolongation of the working day beyond the limits corresponding with the usual price of labor. Face to face with their underselling competitor, they even insist upon extra pay for this overtime. They again do not know that this extra pay includes unpaid labor, just as well as does the price of the customary hour of labor. For example, the price of 1 hour of the 12 hours working day is 3 pence, say the value product of half a working hour, whilst the price of the overtime working hour is 4 pence, or the value product of 2/3 of a working hour. In the first case, the capitalist appropriates to themselves 1/2. In the second, 1/3 of the working hour without paying for it. Comment, in other words, no matter if you're getting overtime or not, you're still not getting the full value that you produced as long as you're doing it in the capitalist shop. And that is the end of Chapter 20. What do you think? Leave a question or comment below, and we will continue the discussion there as always. Otherwise, thanks for listening, and thanks to the current patrons and Buy Me a Coffee supporters whose names are on the screen. If you'd like to get your name on the screen, head to patreon.com/socialismforall or buymeacoffee.com/socialismforall. Every donation is encouraging. They're also materially helpful and allow me to spend a lot more time on this channel than I'd be able to do without that support, so thank you very much. Beyond that, engagement counts, so like, share, subscribe, and leave a comment, even if it's just for the algorithm. And remember, we can agitate and educate online, but the organizing happens in real life, so make sure to take what you've learned here into your real-life political organizing. Thanks again, and we'll see you in the next video. Hey, welcome to Socialism for All. This file is being recorded for the August 2025 edition of Socialism for All, and it's an audiobook of Karl Marx's Capital, Volume 1, Chapter 21, Peace Wages, from 1867. If you like this video, please click like and subscribe, and consider supporting on Patreon or Buy Me a Coffee at patreon.com/socialismforall or buymeacoffee.com/socialismforall. There are links to Patreon and Buy Me a Coffee in the video description. So this chapter is the third of 4 in part 6 of 8 of Capital, Wages. Whereas the last chapter was on time wages, this is going to be on the other major form of wages, peace wages. So where time wages has a worker being paid by an allotment of time, an hour, a day, a week, etc., peace wages have the worker being paid by the number of pieces of whatever it is they're making completed. So it could be nails, it could be widgets, it could be rolling cigars, whatever. It's the number that the worker completes that they're getting paid for. While Marx is going to go into some of the particularities of the peace wages form, the overriding point is that wages in general obscure the exploitation of one class by another, of labor by capital, by making it appear as though labor is being paid for all the value that it's producing, when in fact it isn't. Let's begin. Wages by the piece are nothing else than a converted form of wages by time, just as wages by time are a converted form of the value or price of labor power. In peace wages, it seems at first sight as if the use value bought from the laborer was not the function of their labor power, living labor, but labor already realized in the product, and as if the price of this labor was determined, not as with time wages by the fraction, daily value of labor power divided by the working day of a given number of hours, but by the capacity for work of the producer. Footnote quoting John Watts, Trade Societies and Strikes, Machinery and Cooperative Societies, 1865, the system of piecework illustrates an epoch in the history of the working man. It is halfway between the position of the mere day laborer, depending upon the will of the capitalist, and the cooperative artisan, who in the not distant future promises to combine the artisan and the capitalist in his own person. Piece workers are in fact their own masters, even whilst working upon the capital of the employer." Unquote. I quote this little work because it is a very sink of all long ago rotten, apologetic commonplaces. The same Mr. Watts earlier traded in Owenism, and published in 1842 another pamphlet, Facts and Fictions of Political Economists, in which among other things he declared that, quote, "property is robbery." That was long ago. Back to the main text. The confidence that trusts in this appearance ought to receive a first severe shock from the fact that both forms of wages exist side by side, simultaneously, in the same branches of industry. For example, quote, the compositors of London, as a general rule, work by the piece, time work being the exception, while those in the country work by the day, the exception being work by the piece. The shipwrights of the Port of London work by the job or piece, while those of all other parts work by the day. That's quoting from T.J. Dunning's Trades Unions and Strikes, London, 1860. In the same saddlery shops of London, often for the same work, piece wages are paid to the French, time wages to the English. In the regular factories in which throughout piece wages predominate, particular kinds of work are unsuitable to this form of wage and are therefore paid by time. Footnote, how the existence, side by side and simultaneously, of these two forms of wage favors the master's cheating. Quote, a factory employs 400 people, the half of which work by the piece and have a direct interest in working longer hours. The other 200 are paid by the day, work equally long with the others, and get no more money for their overtime. The work of these 200 people for half an hour a day is equal to one person's work for 50 hours, or 5/6 of one person's labor in a week, and is a positive gain to the employer. That's quoting Reports of Inspector of Factories, 31st October, 1860. And quoting Leonard Horner in Report of Inspector of Factories, 30th April, 1859, overworking to a very considerable extent still prevails, and in most instances with that security against detection and punishment which the law itself affords. I have in many former reports shown the injury to work people who are not employed on piecework but receive weekly wages. Unquote. Back to the main text. But it is moreover self-evident that the difference of form in the payment of wages alters in no way their essential nature, although the one form may be more favorable to the development of capitalist production than the other. Let the ordinary working day contain 12 hours, of which 6 are paid, 6 unpaid. Let its value product be 6 shillings, that of 1 hour's labor, therefore 6 pence. Let us suppose that, as the result of experience, a laborer who works with the average amount of intensity and skill, who therefore gives in fact only the time socially necessary to the production of an article, supplies in 12 hours 24 pieces, either distinct products or measurable parts of a continuous whole. Then the value of these 24 pieces, after subtraction of the portion of constant capital contained in them, is 6 shillings, and the value of a single piece 3 pence. The laborer receives 1.5 pence per piece, and thus earns in 12 hours 3 shillings. Just as with time wages, it does not matter whether we assume that the laborer works 6 hours for themselves and 6 hours for the capitalist, or half of every hour for themselves and the other half for the capitalist. So here it does not matter whether we say that each individual piece is half paid and half unpaid for, or that the price of 12 pieces is the equivalent only of the value of the labor power, whilst in the other 12 pieces surplus value is incorporated. The form of piece wages is just as irrational as that of time wages. Whilst in our example 2 pieces of a commodity, after subtraction of the value of the means of production consumed in them, are worth 6 pence as being the product of 1 hour, the laborer receives for them a price of 3 pence. Piece wages do not, in fact, distinctly express any relation of value. It is not, therefore, a question of measuring the value of the piece by the working time incorporated in it, but on the contrary, of measuring the working time the laborer has expended by the number of pieces they have produced. In time wages, the labor is measured by its immediate duration. In piece wages, by the quantity of products in which the labor has embodied itself during a given time. Footnote, quote, wages can be measured in 2 ways, either by the duration of labor or by its product. That's quoting G. Garnier, Paris, 1796. Back to the main text. The price of labor time itself is finally determined by the equation value of a day's labor equals daily value of labor power. Piece wages, therefore, only a modified form of time wage. Let us now consider a little more closely the characteristic peculiarities of piece wages. The quality of the labor is here controlled by the work itself, which must be of average perfection if the piece price is to be paid in full. Piece wages become, from this point of view, the most fruitful source of reductions of wages and capitalistic cheating. They furnish to the capitalist an exact measure for the intensity of labor. Only the working time, which is embodied in a quantum of commodities determined beforehand and experimentally fixed, counts as socially necessary working time, and is paid as such. In the larger workshops of the London tailors, therefore, a certain piece of work, a waistcoat for example, is called an hour, or half an hour. The hour at 6 pence. By practice it is known how much is the average product of 1 hour. With new fashions, repairs, etc., a contest arises between master and laborer as to whether a particular piece of work is 1 hour, and so on, until here also experience decides. Similarly, in the London furniture workshops, etc. If the laborer does not possess the average capacity, if they cannot in consequence apply a certain minimum of work per day, they are dismissed. Footnote quoting Yor, so much weight of cotton is delivered to him, the spinner, and he has to return by a certain time, in lieu of it, a given weight of twist or yarn of a certain degree of fineness, and he is paid so much per pound for all that he so returns. If his work is defective in quality, the penalty falls on him. If less in quantity than the minimum fixed for a given time, he is dismissed and an abler operative procured. Back to the main text. Since the quality and intensity of the work are here controlled by the form of wage itself, superintendence of labor becomes in great part superfluous. Piece wages therefore lay the foundation of the modern domestic labor described above, as well as of a hierarchically organized system of exploitation and oppression. The latter has two fundamental forms. On the one hand, piece wages facilitate the interposition of parasites between the capitalist and the wage laborer, the subletting of labor. The gain of these middlemen comes entirely from the difference between the labor price which the capitalist pays and the part of that price which they actually allow to reach the laborer. Footnote quoting the Child's Employment Commission's second report, it is when work passes through several hands, each of which is to take its share of profits, while only the last does the work, that the pay which reaches the workwoman is miserably disproportioned. Unquote. Back to the main text. In England, the system is characteristically called the sweating system. On the other hand, piece wage allows the capitalist to make a contract for so much per piece with the head laborer. In manufactures with the chief of some group, in mines with the extractor of the coal, in the factory with the actual machine worker, at a price for which the head laborer themselves undertakes the enlisting and payment of their assistant workpeople. The exploitation of the laborer by capital is here effected through the exploitation of the laborer by the laborer. Footnote here, even Watts, the apologetic, remarks, quote, it would be a great improvement to the system of piecework if all the men employed on a job were partners in the contract, each according to their abilities, instead of one man being interested in overworking their fellows for their own benefit. Unquote. On the vileness of the system, see the Child's Employment Commission third report. Back to the main text. Given piece wage, it is naturally the personal interest of the laborer to strain their labor power as intensely as possible. This enables the capitalist to raise more easily the normal degree of intensity of labor. Footnote, this spontaneous result is often artificially helped along. For example, in the engineering trade of London, a customary trick is, quote, the selecting of a man who possesses superior physical strength and quickness as the principal of several workmen, and paying him an additional rate, by the quarter or otherwise, with the understanding that he is to exert himself to the utmost to induce the others, who are only paid the ordinary wages, to keep up to him. Without any comment, this will go far to explain many of the complaints of stinting the action, superior skill, and working power made by the employers against the men. That's quoting from Dunning's Trade Unions. As the author is himself a laborer and a secretary of a trades union, this might be taken for exaggeration, but the reader may compare the, quote, highly respectable Cyclopedia of Agriculture of J.C. Morton, the article Laborer, where this method is recommended to the farmers as an approved one. Back to the main text. It is moreover now the personal interest of the laborer to lengthen the working day, since with it their daily or weekly wages rise. Footnote. Quote, all those who are paid by piecework profit by the transgression of the legal limits of work. This observation as to the willingness to work overtime is especially applicable to the women employed as weavers and reelers. That's quoting the report of Inspector of Factories, 30th April, 1858. And quoting the Child's Employment Commission first report, this system, meaning piecework, so advantageous to the employer, tends directly to encourage the young potter greatly to overwork himself during the 4 or 5 years during which he is employed in the piecework system, but at low wages. This is another great cause to which the bad constitutions of the potters are to be attributed. Back to the main text. This gradually brings on a reaction like that already described in time wages, without reckoning that the prolongation of the working day, even if the piece wage remains constant, includes of necessity a fall in the price of the labor. In time wages, with few exceptions, the same wage holds for the same kind of work, while in piece wages, though the price of the working time is measured by a certain quantity of product, the day's or week's wage will vary with the individual differences of the laborers, of whom one supplies in a given time the minimum of product only, another the average, and a third more than the average. With regard to actual receipts, there is therefore great variety according to the different skill, strength, energy, staying power, etc. of the individual laborers. Footnote, quoting Dunning, where the work in any trade is paid for by the piece at so much per job, wages may very materially differ in amount, but in work by the day there is generally a uniform rate, recognized by both employer and employed as the standard of wages for the general run of workmen in the trade. Back to the main text. Of course, this does not alter the general relations between capital and wage labor. First, the individual differences balance one another in the workshop as a whole, which thus supplies in a given working time the average product, and the total wages paid will be the average wages of that particular branch of industry. Second, the proportion between wages and surplus value remains unaltered, since the mass of surplus labor supplied by each particular laborer corresponds with the wage received by them. But the wider scope that piece wage gives to individuality tends to develop on the one hand that individuality, and with it the sense of liberty, independence, and self-control of the laborers, and on the other, their competition one with another. Piecework has therefore a tendency, while raising the individual wages above the average, to lower this average itself. But where a particular rate of piece wage has for a long time been fixed by tradition, and its lowering therefore presented especial difficulties, the masters in such exceptional cases sometimes had recourse to its compulsory transformation into time wages. Hence, for example, in 1860, a great strike among the ribbon weavers of Coventry. Footnote, quote, the work of the journeyman artisans will be ruled by the day or by the piece. These master artisans know about how much work a journeyman artisan can do per day in each craft, and often pay them in proportion to the work which they do. The journeymen, therefore, work as much as they can, in their own interest, without any further inspection. That's quoting Cantillon, Essay on the Nature of Commerce in General, Amsterdam edition, 1756, the first edition having appeared in 1755. Cantillon, from whom Quinet, Sir James Stewart, and Adam Smith have largely drawn, already here represents piece wage as simply a modified form of time wage. The French edition of Cantillon professes in its title to be a translation from the English, but the English edition, the analysis of trade, commerce, etc., is not only of later date, 1759, but proves by its contents that it is a later and revised edition. For example, in the French edition, Hume is not yet mentioned, while in the English, on the other hand, Petty hardly figures any longer. The English edition is theoretically less important, but it contains numerous details referring specifically to English commerce, bullion trade, etc., that are wanting in the French text. The words on the title page of the English edition, according to which the work is, quote, taken chiefly from the manuscript of a very ingenious gentleman, deceased and adapted, etc., unquote, seem, therefore, a pure fiction, very customary at that time. Back to the main text. Piece wage is, finally, one of the chief supports of the hour system described in the preceding chapter. And a footnote quoting H. Gregoire, how often have we seen in some workshops many more workers recruited than the work actually called for? On many occasions, workers are recruited in anticipation of future work, which may never materialize. Because they are paid by piece wages, it is said that no risk is incurred, since any loss of time will be charged against the unemployed. Unquote. Back to the main text. From what has been shown so far, it follows that piece wage is the form of wages most in harmony with the capitalist mode of production. Although by no means new, it figures side by side with time wages officially in the French and English labor statutes of the 14th century. It only conquers a larger field for action during the period of manufacture, properly so called. In the stormy youth of modern industry, especially from 1797 to 1815, it served as a lever for the lengthening of the working day and the lowering of wages. Very important materials for the fluctuation of wages during that period are to be found in the Blue Books, Report and Evidence from the Select Committee on Petitions Respecting the Corn Laws, Parliamentary Session of 1813-14, and Report from the Lords Committee on the State of the Growth, Commerce, and Consumption of Grain, and all laws relating thereto, Session of 1814-15. Here we find documentary evidence of the constant lowering of the price of labor from the beginning of the anti-Jacobin War. In the weaving industry, for example, piece wages had fallen so low that, in spite of the very great lengthening of the working day, the daily wages were then lower than before. Quote, the real earnings of the cotton weaver are now far less than they were. His superiority over the common laborer, which at first was very great, has now almost entirely ceased. Indeed, the difference in the wages of skillful and common labor is far less now than at any former period. That's quoting the Remarks on the Commercial Policy of Great Britain, London, 1815. How little the increased intensity and extension of labor through piece wages benefited the agricultural proletariat, the following passage, borrowed from a work on the side of the landlords and farmers, shows, quote, by far the greater part of agricultural operations is done by people who are hired for the day or on piecework. Their weekly wages are about 12 shillings, and although it may be assumed that a man earns on piecework under the greater stimulus to labor, 1 shilling or perhaps 2 shillings more than on weekly wages, yet it is found on calculating his total income that his loss of employment during the year outweighs this gain. Comment, in other words, even if you're getting paid more when you're working, the amount of time you're not working, all these gaps in your employment, is actually outweighing that and bringing down your total annual income. Continuing, further, it will generally be found that the wages of these men bear a certain proportion to the price of the necessary means of subsistence, so that a man with 2 children is able to bring up his family without recourse to parish relief. That's quoting A Defense of the Landowners and Farmers of Great Britain, 1814. Malthus at that time remarked with reference to the facts published by Parliament, quote, "I confess that I see with misgiving the great extension of the practice of piece wage. Really hard work during 12 or 14 hours of the day, or for any longer time, is too much for any human being." That's quoted from Inquiry into the Nature and Progress of Rent, London, 1815. In the workshops under the Factory Acts, piece wages become the general rule because capital can there only increase the efficacy of the working day by intensifying labor. Footnote, quote, "Those who are paid by piecework constitute probably 4/5 of the workers in the factories." That's quoting Report of Inspector of Factories, 30 April 1858. Back to the main text. With the changing productiveness of labor, the same quantum of product represents a varying working time. Therefore, piece wage also varies, for it is the money expression of a determined working time. In our example above, 24 pieces were produced in 12 hours, whilst the value of the product of the 12 hours was 6 shillings, the daily value of the labor power 3 shillings, the price of the labor hour 3 pence, and the wage for 1 piece 1/2 pence. In 1 piece, half an hour's labor was absorbed. If the same working day now supplies, in consequence of the doubled productiveness of labor, 48 pieces instead of 24, and all other circumstances remain unchanged, then the piece wage falls from 1.5 pence to 3/4 pence, as every piece now only represents 1/4 instead of 1/2 of a working hour. 24 times 1.5 pence equals 3 shillings, 36 pence, and in like manner, 48 by 3/4 pence equals 3 shillings. In other words, piece wage is lowered in the same proportion as the number of pieces produced in the same time rises, and therefore as the working time spent on the same piece falls. Footnote quoting Yore, "The productive power of his spinning machine is accurately measured, and the rate of pay for work done with it decreases with, though not as, the increase of its productive power." Unquote. This last apologetic phrase Yore himself again cancels. The lengthening of the mule causes some increase of labor, he admits. The labor does therefore not diminish in the same ratio as its productivity increases. Further, quote, "By this increase, the productive power of the machine will be augmented 1/5. When this event happens, the spinner will not be paid at the same rate for work done as he was before, but as that rate will not be diminished in the ratio of 1/5, the improvement will augment his money earnings for any given number of hours' work. But," Marx adds, quote, "the foregoing statement requires a certain modification. The spinner has to pay something additional for juvenile aid out of his additional 6 pence, accompanied by displacing a portion of adults," unquote, which has in no way a tendency to raise wages. Back to the main text. This change in piece wage, so far purely nominal, leads to constant battles between capitalist and labor, either because the capitalist uses it as a pretext for actually lowering the price of labor, or because increased productive power of labor is accompanied by an increased intensity of the same, or because the laborer takes seriously the appearance of piece wages, viz., that their product is paid for and not their labor power, and therefore revolts against a lowering of wages, unaccompanied by a lowering in the selling price of the commodity. Quote, "The operatives carefully watch the price of the raw material and the price of manufactured goods and are thus enabled to form an accurate estimate of their master's profits." That's quoting from H. Fawcett's The Economic Position of the British Laborer, 1865. The capitalist rightly knocks on the head such pretensions as gross errors as to the nature of wage labor. Footnote, in the London Standard of October 26, 1861, there is a report of proceedings of the firm of John Bright & Company before the Rochdale magistrates, quote, "to prosecute for intimidation the agents of the Carpet Weavers' Trades Union. Bright's partners had introduced new machinery, which would turn out 240 yards of carpet in the time and with the labor," Marx adds an exclamation point, "previously required to produce 160 yards. The workmen had no claim whatever to share in the profits made by the investment of their employer's capital in mechanical improvements. Accordingly, Messrs. Bright proposed to lower the rate of pay from 2.5 pence per yard to 1 pence, leaving the earnings of the men exactly the same as before for the same labor. But there was a nominal reduction, of which the operatives, it is asserted, had not fair warning beforehand." Unquote. Back to the main text. He, the capitalist, cries out against this usurping attempt to lay taxes on the advance of industry, and declares roundly that the productiveness of labor does not concern the laborer at all. And a closing footnote quoting from On Combination of Trades, London, 1834, trades unions, in their desire to maintain wages, endeavor to share in the benefits of improved machinery. Marx adds, what a horror. The demanding higher wages, because labor is abbreviated, is, in other words, the endeavor to establish a duty on mechanical improvements. Unquote. Comment, but one that would actually benefit the majority of the people involved in production. What is the point of having a civilization if not to improve the lives of the people who are its foundation? And that is the end of Chapter 21. What do you think? Leave a question or comment below, and we will continue the discussion in the comments section as always. Otherwise, thanks for listening, and thanks to the patrons and Buy Me a Coffee supporters whose names are on the screen. If you'd like to get your name on the screen, head to patreon.com/socialismforall or buymeacoffee.com/socialismforall. Every donation's encouraging. They also allow me to spend a lot more time on this channel than I'd be able to do without them. So if you like this channel, thank me, but also thank a patron or Buy Me a Coffee supporter and consider becoming one. Beyond that, engagement counts, so like, share, subscribe, and leave a comment, even if it's just for the algorithm. And remember that we can agitate and educate online, but the organizing happens in real life, so make sure to take what you've learned here and apply it in your real-world political organizing. Thanks again, and we'll see you in the next video. Hey, welcome to Socialism for All. This file's being recorded for the August 2025 edition of Socialism for All, and it's an audiobook of Karl Marx's Capital, Volume 1, Chapter 22, National Differences of Wages, from 1867. If you like this video, please click like and subscribe, and consider supporting on Patreon or Buy Me a Coffee at patreon.com/socialismforall or buymeacoffee.com/socialismforall. There are links to Patreon and Buy Me a Coffee in the video description. So, this is the fourth and final chapter in part 6 of 8 of Capital Volume 1, Wages. And in this relatively brief chapter, Marx is going to get into some important topics pertaining to how the value of labor power is to be understood due to the different circumstances in different countries. In other words, wages may be higher or lower in one country versus another, but it doesn't necessarily indicate directly that the workers in one country are more or less exploited or more or less productive, because you have to consider the standard of living in those countries. So here we're talking about the level of development of the country and also the cost of basic necessities that it takes for a worker to reproduce their life and ability to work from day to day, as well as other notions in the culture of that society about what the standard of living should be. So, in other words, we have to differentiate between the nominal wages, or the quantitative amount on its face, versus the real wages, or the actual purchasing power of that money. Another important feature of the landscape in international capitalism is that capital is more mobile than is labor. Yes, the transfer of capital from country to country may be regulated and limited in some ways, but labor much more so. As we know, this can result in a so-called race to the bottom, in which capital says, where am I going to build my factory, here or here? Well, where do I have to pay the workers less money? So this can create competition and downward pressure on wages. So with that as a brief overview, let's get into the reading. In the 17th chapter, we were occupied with the manifold combinations which may bring about a change in magnitude of the value of labor power, this magnitude being considered either absolutely or relatively, i.e. as compared with surplus value. Whilst on the other hand, the quantum of the means of subsistence in which the price of labor is realized might again undergo fluctuations independent of or different from the changes of this price. Footnote, quoting David Buchanan in his edition of Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations, 1814, it is not accurate to say that wages, Marx adds he deals here with their money expression, are increased because they purchase more of a cheaper article. Unquote, back to the main text. As has already been said, the simple translation of the value, or respectively of the price of labor power, into the exoteric form of wages transforms all these laws into laws of the fluctuations of wages. That which appears in these fluctuations of wages within a single country as a series of varying combinations may appear in different countries as contemporaneous difference of national wages. In the comparison of the wages in different nations, we must therefore take into account all the factors that determine changes in the amount of the value of labor power, the price and extent of the prime necessaries of life as naturally and historically developed, the cost of training the laborers, the part played by the labor of women and children, the productiveness of labor, its extensive and intensive magnitude. Even the most superficial comparison requires the reduction first of the average day wage for the same trades in different countries to a uniform working day. After this reduction to the same terms of the day wages, time wage must again be translated into piece wage, as the latter only can be a measure both of the productivity and the intensity of labor. In every country, there is a certain average intensity of labor below which the labor for the production of a commodity requires more than the socially necessary time, and therefore does not reckon as labor of normal quality. Only a degree of intensity above the national average affects, in a given country, the measure of value by the mere duration of the working time. This is not the case on the universal market, whose integral parts are the individual countries. The average intensity of labor changes from country to country. Here it is greater, there less. These national averages form a scale whose unit of measure is the average unit of universal labor. The more intense national labor, therefore, as compared with the less intense, produces in the same time more value, which expresses itself in more money. But the law of value in its international application is yet more modified by the fact that on the world market, the more productive national labor reckons also as the more intense, so long as the more productive nation is not compelled by competition to lower the selling price of its commodities to the level of their value. In proportion as capitalist production is developed in a country, in the same proportion do the national intensity and productivity of labor there rise above the international level. Footnote, we shall inquire in another place what circumstances in relation to productivity may modify this law for individual branches of industry. Back to the main text. The different quantities of commodities of the same kind, produced in different countries in the same working time, have therefore unequal international values, which are expressed in different prices, i.e. in sums of money varying according to international values. The relative value of money will therefore be less in the nation with the more developed mode of capitalist production than in the nation with less developed. It follows then that the nominal wages, the equivalent of labor power expressed in money, will also be higher in the first nation than in the second, which does not at all prove that this holds also for the real wages, i.e. for the means of subsistence placed at the disposal of the laborer. But even apart from these relative differences of the value of money in different countries, it will be found frequently that the daily or weekly etc. wage in the first nation is higher than in the second, while the relative price of labor, i.e. the price of labor as compared both with surplus value and with the value of the product, stands higher in the second than in the first. Footnote, James Anderson remarks in his polemic against Adam Smith, quote, "It deserves likewise to be remarked that, although the apparent price of labor is usually lower in poor countries, where the produce of the soil and grain in general is cheap, yet it is in fact for the most part really higher than in other countries. For it is not the wages that are given to the laborer per day that constitute the real price of labor, although it is its apparent price. The real price is that which a certain quantity of work performed actually costs the employer, and considered in this light, labor is in almost all cases cheaper in rich countries than in those that are poorer, although the price of grain and other provisions is usually much lower in the last than in the first. Labor estimated by the day is much lower in Scotland than in England. Labor by the piece is generally cheaper in England." That's quoting James Anderson, Observations on the Means of Exciting a Spirit of National Industry, etc., 1777. On the contrary, lowness of wages produces, in its turn, dearness of labor. Quote, "Labor being dearer or more expensive in Ireland than it is in England because the wages are so much lower." That's quoting the Royal Commission on Railways, minutes 1867. Back to the main text. J.W. Cowell, member of the Factory Commission of 1833, after careful investigation of the spinning trade, came to the conclusion that, quote, "In England wages are virtually lower to the capitalist, though higher to the operative, than on the continent of Europe." That's quoting Yore. The English factory inspector, Alexander Redgrave, in his report of October 31st, 1866, proves by comparative statistics with continental states that, in spite of lower wages and much longer working time, continental labor is, in proportion to the product, more expensive than English. An English manager of a cotton factory in Oldenburg declares that the working time there lasted from 5:30 a.m. to 8 p.m., Saturdays included, and that the workpeople there, when under English overlookers, did not supply during this time quite so much product as the English in 10 hours, but under German overlookers much less. Wages are much lower than in England, in many cases 50%, but the number of hands, in proportion to the machinery, was much greater, in certain departments in the proportion of 5 to 3. Mr. Redgrave gives very full details as to the Russian cotton factories. The data were given him by an English manager until recently employed there. On this Russian soil, so fruitful of all infamies, the old horrors of the early days of English factories are in full swing. The managers are, of course, English, as the native Russian capitalist is of no use in factory business. Despite all overwork, continued day and night, despite the most shameful underpayment of the workpeople, Russian manufacture manages to vegetate only by prohibition of foreign competition. I give in conclusion a comparative table of Mr. Redgrave's on the average number of spindles per factory and per spinner in the different countries of Europe. He himself remarks that he had collected these figures a few years ago, and that since that time the size of the factories and the number of spindles per laborer in England has increased. He supposes, however, an approximately equal progress in the continental countries mentioned, so that the numbers given would still have their value for purposes of comparison. And so there's a chart here, actually kind of two charts, the average number of spindles per factory and the average number of persons employed to spindles. So first, the average number of spindles per factory. You have England, France, Prussia, Belgium, Saxony, Austria, and Switzerland. The numbers respectively are 12.6 thousand, 1.5 thousand, 1.5 thousand, 4,000, 4.5 thousand, 7,000, and 8,000. And the average number of persons employed to spindles, of course, does not go in the same order. France, Russia, Prussia, Bavaria, Austria, Belgium, Saxony, Switzerland, smaller states of Germany, and Great Britain. And so there's one person to, respectively, 14, 28, 37, 46, 49, 50, 50, 55, 55, and 74 spindles. Quite a variation. Quoting Redgrave again, this comparison is yet more unfavorable to Great Britain inasmuch as there is so large a number of factories in which weaving by power is carried on in conjunction with spinning. Marx adds, while in the table the weavers are not deducted. Quote, and the factories abroad are chiefly spinning factories. If it were possible to compare like with like, strictly, I could find many cotton spinning factories in my district in which mules containing 2,200 spindles are minded by one man, the minder, and 2 assistants only, turning off daily 220 pounds of yarn, measuring 400 miles in length. That's quoting the Report of Inspector of Factories, 31st October, 1866. It is well known that in Eastern Europe as well as in Asia, English companies have undertaken the construction of railways and have, in making them, employed side by side with the native laborers a certain number of English workingmen. Compelled by practical necessity, they thus have had to take into account the national difference in the intensity of labor, but this has brought them no loss. Their experience shows that even if the height of wages corresponds more or less with the average intensity of labor, the relative price of labor varies generally in the inverse direction. In an essay on the rate of wages, one of his first economic writings, H. Carey tries to prove that the wages of the different nations are directly proportional to the degree of productiveness of the national working days, in order to draw from this international relation the conclusion that wages everywhere rise and fall in proportion to the productiveness of labor. And a footnote, the full title here is Essay on the Rate of Wages with an Examination of the Causes of the Differences in the Condition of the Laboring Population Throughout the World, Philadelphia, 1835. The whole of our analysis of the production of surplus value shows the absurdity of this conclusion, even if Carey himself had proved his premises, instead of, after his usual uncritical and superficial fashion, shuffling to and fro a confused mass of statistical materials. The best of it is that he does not assert that things actually are as they ought to be according to his theory, for state intervention has falsified the natural economic relations. The different national wages must be reckoned, therefore, as if that part of each that goes to the state in the form of taxes came to the laborer themselves. Ought not Mr. Carey to consider further whether those, quote, state expenses are not the, quote, natural fruits of capitalistic development? The reasoning is quite worthy of the man who first declared the relations of capitalist production to be eternal laws of nature and reason, and whose free, harmonious working is only disturbed by the intervention of the state. Commenting, I can think of so many people still doing this today. Continuing, in order afterwards to discover that the diabolical influence of England on the world market, an influence which, it appears, does not spring from the natural laws of capitalist production somehow, necessitates state intervention, i.e., the protection of those laws of nature and reason by the state, alias the system of protection. He discovered further that the theorems of Ricardo and others in which existing social antagonisms and contradictions are formulated are not the ideal product of the real economic movement, but on the contrary, that the real antagonisms of capitalist production in England and elsewhere are the result of the theories of Ricardo and others. Finally, he discovered that it is, in the last resort, commerce that destroys the inborn beauties and harmonies of the capitalist mode of production. A step further, and he will perhaps discover that the one evil in capitalist production is capital itself. Only a man with such atrocious want of the critical faculty and such spurious erudition deserved, in spite of his protectionist heresy, to become the secret source of the harmonious wisdom of a Bastiat and of all the other free trade optimists of today. And that is the end of Chapter 22 and of Part 6 of 8, Wages. What do you think? Leave a question or comment below. We will continue the discussion in the comment section as always. Otherwise, thanks for listening, and thanks to the current patrons and Buy Me a Coffee supporters whose names are on the screen. If you'd like to get your name on the screen, head to patreon.com/socialismforall or buymeacoffee.com/socialismforall. You can make a recurring or one-time donation, whatever you prefer. Every donation is encouraging. They're also materially helpful and allow me to spend a lot more time on this channel than I'd be able to do otherwise. So if you like this channel, where we don't run ads, thank me, but also thank a patron or Buy Me a Coffee supporter, and consider becoming one yourself. Beyond that, engagement counts, so like, share, subscribe, and leave a comment even if it's just for the algorithm. And finally, remember, we can agitate and educate online, but the organizing happens in real life, so make sure you take what you've learned here into your real-life political organizing where you live. Thanks again, and we'll see you in the next video.